All right, Mr. Jeff. So I think we've got critical mass, and people can watch the video if they missed the first part. So you and I have known each other a long time,
Yeah,
which is a sign that this is going to be one of those behavioral scientists conversations about people who've been doing it for a while. Where we generally start these interviews is, how did you get into this? Like, where did this start for you?
sure. So it actually goes back a bit. So my first graduate degrees were in my first graduate degree was in pure math, and I was really interested in mathematics, but mostly mathematics that had been developed to study the foundations of mathematics, so like mathematical logic and so forth. So I got very interested in reasoning, mathematical models of reasoning. So that's how kind of my interest in kind of mathematical models of decision making grew out of my interest in mathematical models of reasoning. So I eventually moved to this really interesting interdisciplinary PhD at Carnegie Mellon between math and computer science and philosophy. And one of the key members of that program was Herb Simon. And Herb Simon could really be regarded as really like even before Kahneman and Tversky, Herb Simon won his Nobel Prize in economics for his work on bounded rationality, and is also an important figure in artificial intelligence for his work with Alan Newell. So Simon was a really influential figure in that program, and so I started, really getting interested in sort of the interplay between sort of normative theories of decision making, like how one ought to decide, which is an important idea in kind of statistical inference and also in economics. And then also sort of like that on the one hand, and then these sort of claims by Kahneman and Tversky to have shown that there are systematic deviations from these sort of rationality assumptions. And so I got really interested in the interplay between those things, especially like questions about foundations of measurement. And so that's sort of what I focused on in graduate school. Yeah.
Time out, man. I have
Yeah.
so many questions. First of all, I love that you brought up Herb Simon, right?
Okay.
Because obviously my undergraduate advisor was Barry Schwartz, right? So, Herb was the first one to sort of talk about satisficing
Yeah.
as a thing, which of course went on to Barry sort of looked at choice versions of that. It's
Yep.
interesting. The first class I ever took with Barry, we started with sort of like logic, like
Mhm.
formal logic, which many
Yeah.
people, once upon a time was a very common thing to learn and study in school. But now I think it's somewhat more rare. I don't think a lot of people get that sort of like philosophical, like the symbols of formal logic. Can you write out a formal logic thing?
Right. Right.
Which was kind of fun and interesting. And, Barry, at Swarthmore, the psychology and philosophy department were the same building, right? I
Okay.
always, I always like the positioning. Philosophy and psychology are in the same building, and it was situated next to the engineering building and the science building,
Mhm.
like at the science campus. And I was like, aha, psychology, like the interesting interplay between philosophy and these other things. Take us back in time a little bit. You sort of glossed over this. You were like, I'm interested in, like, give us a young Jeff. Like, did you know you want to do applied stuff, or was it
No.
really like how did you get into sort of like, where's undergraduate? Like, go even farther back. Like,
Yeah.
painted Jeff as a young man.
I was really like so reading books like Gödel, Escher, Bach when I was a kid. That kind of stuff was, or at least trying to read that as a kid. That was very influential on me because I was really captivated by the idea that you could represent certain kinds of reasoning, with a computer, and you could carry out certain kinds of things that seemed like cognitive processing. So I was really captivated by that idea. I think even when I got my first computer, just being able to sort of experiment with that and try to do things that simulate or seem to capture some aspect of thought, even though they really didn't. They were just naive. But I mean, I was really fascinated by that. I thought that was really cool. And so I
All
think
right.
that more than anything else, yeah,
Not to age you.
yeah.
What's your first computer here?
Oh, I had a Commodore VIC 20. Yeah, which was before the Commodore 64. I think it was. This is a long time ago. Yeah, like in school, we were very lucky to have like access to an Apple IIe or something like that. You know.
Got it. And so you had really early formative experiences with
Yeah,
computers.
yeah. I really love that, and so I think the idea of being able to understand aspects of thinking, and be able to, like, at least in the sense that you could replicate it or explain it or or simulate it with a machine. I think that was really a fascinating idea. And so when I read about things like the early work that grew out of the foundations of mathematics, where people were like, well, some people were like, well, mathematics is just reducible to like formal games on symbols and stuff like that, this kind of formalist view. And there are other people who are like, well, mathematics is reducible to logic. There are all these attempts to, in the early, like the Hilbert's program and stuff, if you've ever heard of that. Of course, Gödel's incompleteness theorems, are famously associated with sort of putting some limits on these kinds of things. But it was really, like, to me, just really fascinating to think about, sort of the kinds of reasoning you might try to represent, using a digital computer. And I think the whole idea of cognitive science, which really kind of takes advantage of this sort of analogy between, like, computers, algorithms operating on data structures, and in some sense we are carrying out some kind of cognitive operations on our internal representations. I think just that whole thing was really what excited me the most.
So I have visions of like teenage Jeff, like wondering about, sort of, do we have free will? Is it all deterministic? Like, what is happening here?
I was actually like, that's probably giving me way too much credit. In high school, I was like getting expelled from school and getting all kinds of trouble, and I was not. Yeah, that's really. I wish that were true. That I was mostly hanging around with like musicians and other
Well,
crazy.
I think Frank Zappa was probably having the same conversation about whether or not, free will existed. I think
Yeah, sure.
musicians can be fantastic, and I love that tribal making aspect of you. You've always, you have a little bit of that spark today,
Thanks.
and I always like it. You've always been disrupting industry. So we go off into sort of graduate. We like transition somewhat from math to sort of like pure math to more applied math economy.
Yeah, more like foundations of decision theory, foundations of measurement, kind of like, philosophy of science, more, epistemology. Yeah. So yeah, that kind of thing. And then after I finished my PhD, I should mention that a couple other important influences during that time. First, Robin Dawes, who is a great figure in psychology, and really just like, even classic papers like the robust beauty of improper linear models, the stuff that he kind of carried on from Paul Meehl on expert judgment. Really like interesting thinker. He was on my committee, and my dissertation advisor, Teddy Seidenfeld, who is the Herbert A. Simon Professor of Computer Science, Philosophy, I don't know, some 18 other subjects, whatever. He was a great influence on me as well. His on in Foundations of Decision Theory. And then when I graduated, I went and took a job as an assistant professor of philosophy at Columbia, and I took on a lot of the idea was I was going to take on a lot of the kind of course load that the great philosopher Isaac Levi, who was also a really important friend and mentor to me, he was retiring, and so I was going to kind of take on a lot of that stuff. And so I was there for like about a decade. I didn't really like it. I really was pretty unhappy most of the time. I loved being at Carnegie Mellon in the interdisciplinary environment there, but Columbia was a very traditional philosophy department. I didn't really fit in to that very well. So eventually, academia, and I parted ways, and I took a job at AIG.
Well, wait. Let's
Yeah.
pause that moment, because this is a lot of
Yeah.
the conversation that we've had and seen from
Sure.
people, sort of like, should I go this academic route? Like, where am I in? It's so funny. I had a conversation the other day with somebody who was a tenured professor and was thinking about leaving to do more applied work,
Yeah.
and which is a big decision. I mean, tenure is very, it's a hard thing to get. You work very hard,
Sure,
very
sure.
long
Yeah.
to sort of get it. But he was just like, I just can't stomach not doing applied stuff anymore. Tell us about, so you're in this philosophy department, it's Columbia, it's not really working out. You could have gone to another institution at some point.
I could have. I mean, so just to be clear, I didn't have tenure. I didn't get tenure, but I kind of knew that I wasn't going. My heart wasn't really in it, like even years before, and so I think I started kind of like gradually moving my foot out the door. Even then, yeah, I could have gone to other places, and I could have done things differently that would have made my tenure case easier. But I think ultimately I just didn't really like. I kind of, it was like sort of inertia, but like I didn't really care. You know what I mean? Like I just wasn't happy. So I started reading a lot of stuff on kind of like applied decision analysis, that kind of the this kind of like Keeney and Rafa. I don't know if you know this, Howard Rafa, Ralph Keeney, Ronald Howard, these sort of like people who developed these sort of like in the 60s, these sort of, frameworks for doing sort of applied decision theory, right? But you wouldn't really necessarily think of it as like bread and butter behavioral science these days, but the methods are still used, especially like in areas like where you have big expensive decisions that are going to be made like one time, like where to dig for oil or something like that, or which drug to develop, these kinds of things. Yeah, so I started reading a lot about that, wondering like sort of where there were sort of openings of people doing that kind of work there, because I really wanted to keep in touch with the more normative and prescriptive side. But then this opportunity opened up at AIG, which was clearly more on the what is closer to what people think of as behavioral science now, but not as nudge centric then. It was a bit different. The
Well,
nudge stuff is sorry.
let,
Yeah, go ahead.
let's situate this in time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because
go ahead.
this is what year is this?
2014.
Okay, so this 2014 nudges come out. People, we have a sense of, somewhat in 2014 we kind of knew what the field sort of looked like, although uh, I don't know that I'm trying to remember the first time like I had behavioral science in my title as opposed to, early in my career. I came out as a head of product when I came out of academia
Yeah.
at a startup, and then lead scientist was what we started calling me at the second startup. Um, and I think I might have started to use the term behavioral science at Microsoft, which I think was sort of in this range of times.
Yeah, I think mine was one of the first positions like that in a kind of big company like that had that name. I mean, the reason as far as I know, at least in my industry, and that's probably around the time that you and I met. I think probably back
Yeah.
then.
And what did they think they were getting? So this is another conversation that has come up a couple of times. What did they think they were buying? Right. So they like put out this job posting. Who put it out? First of all, like who's your boss? Who's looking for this thing? And what do they think they're buying when they get jobs?
So that, I mean, without getting into lots of details, I mean that grew out of like an engagement that um you know Kahneman and his firm at the time that the Greatest Good had with the global insurer that I work for, AIG. And so, they sort of had a engagement there. They were doing some work and, but more as a consultancy. And so there was a interest in sort of someone carrying on that kind of work. But, what works like, well, first of all, I mean, the projects were not really about nudge or bias. They were really more about what Danny talks about in his more recent book, the noise stuff, right? So that, and when Danny and I would talk about that, I mean, he always thought that the noise, what he thinks of as noise, was like a bigger issue. So like I mean, one thing that like I first of all, I had a strange. I'm very thankful for the time that I got to spend with Danny. He couldn't have been more gracious. I probably grew up in a tradition that disagrees with basically everything he says. Uh, I mean, coming from like a more of a Simon slash Gigerenzer kind of view, and really kind of suspicious about like the amount of talk about bias. So I came into like my interactions with Danny like kind of already sort of geared up to have that argument. And if you've ever like seen any of the classic exchanges between Gigerenzer and Kahneman Tversky, I think this is like maybe mid 90s or so, and maybe Psych Review, like classic exchanges between these two groups. And I sort of was like gearing up on those arguments. And but I found Danny to be like very open-minded and charitable person. He did think that like in a company like in insurance companies, which he thought of as sort of like decision factories, because we do make a lot of decisions, right? We have to. I mean, you think about like simple things like whether or not to quote on a consumer auto or something like that, personal auto. That's like it's just all done by machines, right? That's like black box underwriting. But when you get into more complicated things that are a bit more bespoke, there's like a huge combination of like human judgment, machines. It's like it comes to very rich kind of from a decision making point of view, and the consequences are serious, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty. So
Well, let's drill in on that a second, because
yeah,
not everybody
sorry.
is
I don't
as
mean to
familiar.
wander, yeah, but
No, I love your wandering,
yeah.
but
Okay.
not as everybody's as familiar with insurance as you are.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Sure.
Average consumer experience, to your point, like, underwriters make a model, they update the model sort of says insure this or don't insure this, or insure this at this price. Nobody, I think this is an illusion that sometimes people, my State Farm agent is like choosing my rate. No, econometric models are choosing your rate. Like, that's why we can do it online, right?
So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
But doing more bespoke things. Talk about a bespoke. I don't think people realize the full scope of the
Well,
weird things that we insure in the world.
I mean, suppose you're like, someone insures the NFL, right? How many NFLs are there? someone insures the Freedom Tower. How many Freedom Towers? You know what I mean? You get started getting the things, or someone insures Walmart. People are like, start getting into entities that are so large and unique. There just aren't a lot of comparables. So the whole process becomes much more complicated than just like looking at some averages in a bucket. You know what I mean? And that's just on the underwriting side. Of course, there's a claims side too, where human judgment comes into play. So claims can spiral out of control, right? They can be litigated. You might not see you might see something litigated goes on for years, and like in those cases, they typically go and ask a adjuster to give a case reserve, to say something about how much do we expect this to cost, right? Because for reserving purposes. And so you are asking for a human judgment in both parts there, both the underwriting part and the claims part, when you are getting to the stuff that's complicated enough, right? Where it just can't all be modeled. You know what I mean? At least there's a view that that we should do this, or we need to do this. Now, how do you demonstrate that it's actually valuable? That's a complicated thing in insurance, because there's just a lot of confounders. I mean, but the thing is that you could do experiments, right? You can ask, and Danny talks about these kinds of experiments and noise, and you could just kind of give a bunch of underwriters the same kind of fact base and kind of ask them to price it out, or give a bunch of adjusters the same fact base, and say, give us your case reserve, right? Tell me what you think we're going to pay in 12 months. And you can see like huge spread, right? Like the variance is huge, right? So like that's the noise. Like, Danny is in that sense is saying, look, you're getting the same fact base, right? But depending on who I send it to that day, I'm going to get a wildly different. And he's, arguing there that noise is costly. Now, you could do experiments and show that noise is reduced in a kind of experimental setting, right? You could say, okay, well, now I'm going to give, okay, so now I give one group, you're going to just price it without my new behavioral science tool. And the other one's going to get my behavioral science tool. Now we're going to look at the spread for the ones that use the behavioral science tool compared to the variance of the ones that did, right? And I'm going to say, look, I've controlled your variance. I've reduced the variance. I mean, of course, you could reduce the variance in trivial ways, right? You could just say, everyone give this number, right? I mean, you could just, right? I mean, like
the answer is 5,
right? So I mean, like just reducing the variance in itself is not enough. But I mean, it's more than that. But even if you get that to work out sensibly in experiment, you still have to make that tool kind of work in an embedded system, in an actual environment, and that's a complicated thing that I think we didn't foresee in those projects. How complicated that is, because what happened was, some of the tools that got uh, developed, right? And they got developed by kind of, and I've talked about this, in Vegas when we were talking about this, that, some of the tools that got developed because there's a big push from management to say, use these tools because we've got some, smart Nobel Prize winners who are, behind this and, use these. And like, and then the people down the line are like, look, basically, I'm going to use it if it's kind of helpful for me doing my work. If it's going to, so they didn't really find it that helpful, but they had to use it. So what happens? Well, this is human behavior, right? So what they end up doing is they end up backfilling the tool. So they start with the number they want to get to, right, and work backwards. But that's also human behavior, right? And a good design needs to also consider that. So I found like in there, like in a way, there was smart behavioral science in the tools and but in another way, it was kind of like ignorant of the context that it would actually be, you know what I mean? It kind of like forgot about that. So you like do this clean experiment, you show some noise reduction with your tool, you got a nice point, maybe for an academic point, but you go to implement it and you've totally forgotten the fact that like
Someone
there's not
doesn't use that.
and it doesn't work. So that was a huge lesson for me. Like, there's a sense in academia where you can kind of sometimes nicely bound a problem, come up with the boundaries and then solve that. But when you do something that's like being embedded in a system like that, there are all kinds of unintended side effects, and you can't control all that. And I think that part really got me thinking more about kind of design and engineering side.
And
Yeah.
did that happen while you were at AIG? So you sort of
Yeah.
just sort of situating this, like Kahneman comes in with sort of consulting, they figure out, and this is a story we've heard a lot, right? That there's some initial consulting engagement and that often leads to you needing the first person, right? Or deciding, hey, I'm going to open up a full-time role. I'm going to do, this is Steph Habif started as a consultant.
Yeah.
Connor was talking yesterday about getting his job at Microsoft by doing a bunch of free consulting essentially, and then that becoming the justification for the position, right?
Sure.
So Kahneman's doing this thing, you come in, you're making, perfect models, right? Like academically lovely, wonderful in the constraints of academia. You roll out your first version, uptake is not where you want it to be. How do you start to pivot as a person and as a team towards usage? Do you bring on designers and engineers? Like this is more of a mental exercise for you learning? Like how does it transition?
I think because I remember I was coming from academia, so there's a lot of lessons in sort of learning about this aspect of the job. So, I spent a lot of time talking to like, say, the people who are running um, claims for like a big division, and these are people who run like I'm talking big. AIG is a monster. It's a big company. So when I say someone who's running workers' comp claims, I'm saying these people have lots and lots of people working for them on very expensive claims. So um, these people have stressful jobs. Getting them to so picture yourself. You say, look, um, we've been looking at this tool, the usage. We suspect this is happening. What can we do? Well, if the people there at that point are not really like going to back it, you kind of have to pivot and then think like, okay, what can I do for these people, these managers? I mean, these are executives. I mean, what can I do that would be useful to them? Because this tool, I got to be honest. I mean, I don't see a big future in it because I'm up against it may be that there's some good psychology behind it at a certain sense, but I'm up against a wall here. They've got more important things to do in their mind. They feel like they've given it a shot. The thing is, the stuff is, in decline. So I think at that point I started to think, well, a couple things. One, could we salvage anything of it, like as a data collection mechanism? Could we learn anything about the signal we're picking? So I pursued that as one line. I also started opening up other kind of branches, where I thought maybe we could be helpful, right? Like suggesting other projects, because I had to be honest that I felt like the days for that project were numbered once the kind of consultancy started to withdraw, that I could see the writing on the wall, and so I guess that was one of those sort of like another lesson I've learned in business is like, don't get too attached to your projects. Like, don't be afraid to kind of kill it. If it's like just kind of doubling down on that, I think would have been like our downfall, like, very quickly because we didn't really have our hands in a lot of things. So I started getting our hands in other things, trying to build more of a portfolio, hoping that some of the things would click. You know what I mean?
And let's talk about that for a second because I think
Yeah.
that's really important. How are you doing? Like, you're going on a listening tour, trying to find the problems. You're finding things that you think you can solve and pitching them in. How is this
A
as you're
mix.
starting to spread the portfolio? How does that happen for you as an executive?
A mix, and it was a mix of things. I also had people, who were I was working as part of the science division at AIG, so we were part of that. So I had other people throwing projects that we towards us too, like from in science, which was sort of like an internal consultancy, a large internal consultancy within AIG. So I had the benefit of that. I was sort of buffered. I didn't have to go directly to selling to like, the CEO. I was fortunate to have people who are now big executives in their own right, like Madhu Tatakonda and stuff like that, who were, I mean, kind of, providing a bit of a buffer between that and sort of what we were trying to do. So I was thankful for that as someone who had just come out of academia, and my skills as far as like being comfortable talking to people who had a lot of domain knowledge, because I think one of the things is like, this is probably true for a lot of behavioral science people. I mean, you're kind of new on the block, just like data science, and you feel like the people who are the established domain knowledge experts, they're kind of like, why the hell are you here? What are you doing? And you do have to kind of show something of value. You know what I mean? You can't just kind of go around talking like an academic. I mean, that gets old for them, at least in the insurance crowd. I mean, that gets old pretty quickly because those people, they have a bottom line and they know their stuff. And you might be, but the thing is, like, look, I mean, um you know a lot of the systems they set up, one of the things that I just a quick side, it reminds me of something like, so AIG Science was set up because Peter Hancock wanted to have this really big investment in science and brought in all these PhDs, and I came in kind of brash and thinking like, geez, this everything. I look at the way people do things here, and it just seems so backwards, and people are cutting and pasting, things from Excel sheets, and like it looks horrible. Like everything seems so inefficient. Like, the data is like all over the place. And then you kind of start to realize that like some of these things kind of like develop organically. And I remember one time a really smart economist, University of Chicago trained economist who was also at AIG Science, after a discussion, he put a little fence on my desk, and and I asked why he put it there, and he said, well, just he said, someone once told me to, before you tear a fence down, try to understand why it was put up in the first place. And some of these systems, although they're kind of like locally very like they look like they've been kind of duct taped together, it's interesting how they've kind of, some of these structures have formed, that it's like they're not always totally inefficient. It depends on sort of the um, view you're taking, but you can start to understand why they may have been assembled. Not to say you can't improve upon them, but it's sometimes better in some of these discussions to really try to find what might be good in there, because you're talking to someone who's sort of like, they've been trained to do things a certain way. And if you can kind of like try to find something good in there that you could build on, it's just kind of more disarming. I mean, and often there is something good, that could be built on. It's not all bad. It's not,
Yeah, I love that point. I want to highlight a couple of things you said and remind folks that if you have individual questions, you can always hit the raise your hand button and we'll make sure that you get in. Otherwise, Jeff and I'll just keep chatting. Um, A couple things you said in there that I really liked. One was, having some sponsors, right? As you came out of academia, knowing, or learning, maybe not knowing, but learning over time that you didn't quite have your hands around it all. And then having those buffer sponsors who could help you, present, navigate AIG, be sort of Sherpas as you try and figure out those internal politics, I think is really important. I love the point about the fence, right? A lot of behavioral science is about the well-worn path, right? Like we build the thing that goes like this and everybody's cutting across here. And, why are they doing that? Trying to understand their motivations, their things. I love, uh, uh, this transition for you between, sort of behavioral science as the tool is the behavioral science versus the getting people to use it is the behavioral science. You start to look at AIG itself as the behavior change uh,
Yeah.
uh, project. Where did you find success, right? So the first thing's not really getting adopted in the way, it's getting adopted top down because it has to, but people are sort of not using it the way you want. You recognize the writing on the wall. Where do you find wins? Like, how do you get to those places?
So for me, I did a pivot at around a few years in, and I really started to get much more interested in kind of behavioral analytics and more like on the data science, machine learning, stat side, but really focusing on either modeling human behavior or building data science type products that were helpful for decision makers. So I started kind of moving more towards that. Not that they're so different. I mean, a lot of the cases like, so my first case like that was I left AIG Science and I went to work for, still in AIG. I worked for a really dynamic young leader who's since become a successful entrepreneur on his own in his own right, but who had taken over a division of AIG, the shared services division. So shared services developed at AIG and a lot of big corporations where they take a certain small job, right? Could be like in the case of insurance, it could be like first notice of loss. So when you have something happen, you contact your insurance company and you file and you do what's called a first notice of loss. So you'll talk to someone, most likely they're going to take some information. It's going to be some intake, right? They're going to get, and then there'll be follow-ups, but that's getting you in the system, right? First notice of loss would be a typical thing that might be done by shared services at a call center. That call center is probably located in a place that is lower cost labor and right, and so you know how this works, right? So there are lots of things like that. It could be like setting up a claim, setting up a policy. There are tons of things like this in a big insurance company. So you know, insurance like products could have all kinds of complicated riders on them, like gathering these forms. So there's a ton of stuff like this. So when Chaz Pereira, who I was working for, took this over, he was kind of had this sort of like he had all the thousands of these shared services, were literally thousands, and he was getting these reports on the quality and speed of the work being done. And I mean, there was no rhyme or reason to the measurements, right?
Yeah.
So he was like, look, could you come and try to measure the quality and speed of these different things that widgets, let's say, that are being made. I've got 800 different widgets being made by 10,000 different people in 5 different locations across the globe. There's no rhyme or reason to any of they send me these quality estimates, these time estimates, and they're all over the place. Can you try to do something? And so that was really the first time that I was like, really focusing more on building a product where I was going to measure something about the behavior of these people, and that estimates of those things were going to be then used as decision inputs by executives. And so kind of thinking of that, the creation of that thing as the behavioral intervention, that was the tool, that was the thing that I was going to give them, kind of refocused me around more like data and that kind of stuff rather than more like traditional interventionalist kind of thing where you would run an RCT, right? And here's an intervention, here's my treatment 1, here's treatment 2. So I kind of pulled away from that for a variety of reasons. One, that it was very difficult to do that kind of stuff in that environment. It wasn't really a consumer facing kind of thing. So it's not like a marketing kind of thing. There was some of that, but I just didn't believe that it was really like going to be like the future there. So, and it wasn't really my interest either. So, while we did do some of that digital ad stuff and those sites RCTs, I definitely made a strong pivot to this kind of
You're
more,
almost,
yeah.
you're almost like a people analytics person at this point, right?
I
You
mean,
know, we're
yeah, I mean, it's grown from that, but yeah, that became, which really fit well with my background, actually coming from more like a foundations of stats kind of. So, I mean, it was a bunch of questions that interest me. Opportunity came up, and I chose the path that seemed the most promising at the time. You know.
and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I say often when Frog hired me, they expected the projects that would come in would be primarily sort of frog shaped things, get people to go through a line faster, or sort of stuff that Walmart or Disney or whoever it was kind of cared about. And probably 50% of the things that came in were internally focused. Hey, we're a big company, we're doing a layoff for the first time, but we really want those people who are laid off to go work for a vendor so that we can kind of hire them back.
Right.
Like, can you get this behavior that is like working for the vendor? Probably 50% of our stuff was internal. And it's ironic, I ended up managing the call center at Clover
Okay.
for a while, and had the same experience you did, where I was like looking at these metrics and going like, none of these metrics are the things they're like at best bad proxies for the things I care about.
Yeah.
But are really poor understandings of like how these humans in these call centers are actually doing anything.
Yeah.
Time on call tells you, so little about what's actually happening there.
Right.
So you there's a talk to me about the people that are around you at this time, right? Because you did have, I mean, it's not just Jeff, right?
No. I had originally the original team, I had several people at various times. I mean, some very junior people that I kind of inherited, some more senior people that I hired. I had to actually fire one person, which was a little early in my career, which was a weird experience. Just did not have great preparation for that in my kind of academic background. Um, so, um, yeah, I mean, so there were people around. When I moved into the operations team to run this measurement of the shared services, I took just only one person with me. Originally, the plan was to develop a team around that. That never really came to fruition because we had a change of leadership at AIG, and that whole team got scrapped. This is another thing being at big companies, at least at AIG during that time, we had a lot of change at the top. So like the idea of a centralized kind of analytics team in New York was not really like the focus anymore. And they decided to push that stuff out to the actual products. Or in the case of claims, like the actual lines. So that kind of started to fall apart. And then I moved to AIG, started an insurtech called Blackboard. And it was a big investment. Had a kind of partnership with like companies like Two Sigmas, insurance division and stuff. And it was a big enterprise that was focused on kind of middle market, and um, that was eventually shut down by AIG right around the start of the pandemic. It was making money, but I think AIG just thought it was just in their interest better to just take a write down and not be in that business. They just didn't kind of want to be in that space, I think. Um, and also there was another change of leadership, actually, another CEO change. Brian Dupereau, who is a champion of it, was kind of retiring, and so that closed, and then that probably at its peak had about 100 something people, and then the core team at Blackboard um, reassembled and about, I don't know, it was probably about 16, 17 of us created Joyn.
Which
And
is where you work now.
which is where I work now, yes. And so Joyn is probably now up to about, I don't know, 25 people. We just finished a big Series A round that was in the news. And it's a lot of the core people, actually a lot of people I've known since AIG, a bunch of AIG science people, but a lot of just, it's a good blend of kind of like industry experts and, people coming from like the tech, data science, behavioral science, whatever kind of, side. And it's, I think it's picking up. So what I've done there and at Blackboard is really kind of more of a continuation of this sort of decision analytics, whatever you want to call it. But like, I definitely think about, I would say a characteristic thing would be that we definitely try to think about the decision maker, right, that we're trying to help. So every problem that we try to work on, or that I try to find what is the decision we're trying to improve, you know? And so, but beyond that, I mean, there's quite a range of engagements. I mean, there could be things where we want to kind of replicate some aspect of human decision making because um, suppose we have like huge volumes of things coming in, right? We don't want to have to hire like a gazillion underwriters. They're pretty expensive. So we'd like to be able to at least have some filtering, right, of things that our underwriters tend to like, And so things like that, a tool like that, really, you're asking, like, you're trying to understand something about, well, what are our underwriters likely to engage in? Because if it's unlikely they're going to engage in it, I don't want to bother them with it because their cognitive resources are quite expensive, and we want to focus their limited kind of attention on places that matter because they're going to get tired throughout their day. There are only so many of these that they can look at. When we get a payload that comes in, the data, I mean, when I say, like, you imagine, like, whatever data scenario you imagine, a single payload comes in, and that's about like 30,000 lines of JSON, like semi-structured data. That's one thing that came in, right? I mean, like, and it's got riders and things embedded in it, and ratings that I mean, unless I don't think there are a lot of industries that see like a single case come in and and you have this much kind of embedded complexity, that's just semi-structured. And so that's sort of like kind of the challenge, because you want to find, I mean, do you have enough signal in there to kind of replicate the underwriter's tastes, or predict what they'd like? Or despite picking up all this stuff, is it really just these phone calls between the underwriter and the broker that are really driving it? We're still, even with 30,000 lines of data, JSON collected on a single submission when it comes in, we still don't even really have captured what really matters, because who knows, like, it could be like these, kind of long-term relationships with brokerages that are really between broker and underwriter that are driving it. And so there are a lot of complexities that really make just doing something like that, what might seem straightforward, quite complicated in our world. It's really not like you've got a nice grid, here's a picture, every little square could be in one of, like, a couple hundred states. It's not like that.
I
uh,
love this distinction you're drawing between sort of automation and augmentation, right? Sort of
yeah,
how do I take things away, right, and
yeah,
just sort of make them with reasonable best fit models of things,
yeah,
versus sort of, how do I provide narrowed information, enhanced information, enriched information, however you want to look at it, right? That humans still making the decision, but I am supporting them in that decision making, which you've gone back and forth
yeah,
in your career,
yeah,
through.
yeah.
How are you liking it at a startup for AIG? That's a really big pivot as a behavioral scientist. Do you think you'd end up back in a big company? What do you like about startups? Where the challenge is?
So in a startup, you have to wear lots of different hats. So I do. I write software too. So like I'll build models. I write software. I have to do visualization stuff. I mean, I have to do it like kind of. You have to kind of do everything, right? So we have a small R&D team that we've been together for a while. It consists of one theoretical physicist, one PhD computer scientist slash kind of electrical engineering type, and then me. And we used to be bigger. We had a few more people at Blackboard, but the three of us came along, and we kind of all sort of have to do a little bit of everything. Some of us do a bit more on the like, we do our own DevOps, so like, we have to do, we've got to, get things running in the cloud and stuff. We can't really kick our stuff over to the front end engineers because they're really doing a different kind of thing. So I'd say being in a startup, one thing is a little stressful, is just it's stressful and you learn a lot. But you just have to kind of do a lot of different things, right? You can't be when there are only 18 people, right? And you have like, some of them are underwriters, some are insurance people. You've got some front end, kind of, engineer types, and you've got like, all the, machine learning, deployment kind of data science, all that kind of, stuff. That's all got to come from somewhere. And it's like, so you'd end up doing a lot of different things.
Shay, I see your hand. I'm going to come to you in just one second. I want to sort of, Jeff, I want to close off on this point.
Yeah.
Take us back in that moment, right? You're at AIG, you're at Blackboard, which sort of this, you have this progression from AIG to like the more experimental ventures-y part of AIG,
Yeah.
and then out to a startup. What informed, you could have gone to another insurance company. You're an eminently employable guy, like other big insurance companies. You could have stayed in big insurance. What was the decision maker for you about making the leap to something different, right? Sort of saying like, hey, I'm going to take this, you could have kept bouncing around inside of AAG or wherever kind of endlessly.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes that actually sounds kind of nice, but once in a while, but so I joke with my wife about that. I'm like, I just want to go back to a big corporate and bounce around like for a while until I retire. But it was first of all, to make a successful insurtech requires a lot of things, right? First you have to believe that there's demand for the kind of stuff you are doing. And so like this excess specialty space that we were kind of focused in, there's a lot of reason to like, there have been a lot of market studies that suggest that this space is a good one for us to be in. It's a little like more open-ended, it's a little more like a lot of market of last resort type stuff. So there's also like, for people to really kind of buy in, it's not at this point, I don't think, as much about like just the pure technology play. It's like, do you in our space, it's also, do you believe that you have the credible insurance people to lead? And I think that really we've had a veteran group. Sarina Masia, our CEO, is very, very well known in the industry. I mean, from her time at AIG, she's on the board of, Credit Suisse, and like so she's a very well known figure. And then also, I knew a lot of the. Of course, I knew the R&D people. There are people I knew from AIG Science, and I believed in what they were doing. And I still do. I mean,
so a big part of the decision for you was people, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. I've always been much more of like, I don't really care that much about like if yeah, to me it's like the people. I don't care that much about the name of the company. Yes, I care about comp in the sense that like, yeah, I don't want to work forever and I have 4 kids, but I'm not like, I like to work on interesting problems with interesting people. And if I had to be like totally honest, the most valuable thing I've probably gotten over the last few years is the opportunity to work with a couple really, really outstanding engineers who had a completely different, one in particular who had just came from kind of like a Bell Labs sort of tradition, more from the telecom industry. And we have such interesting discussions, and his way of looking at problems is so different than mine that it's just been like something that I had to reconcile and kind of like, I needed to absorb more of his thought process into my toolbox. And that may have been one of the most valuable things, sort of like so sometimes it's even just 1 or 2 people who are, just really kind of push you a little bit in certain directions that make you grow, even in kind of uncomfortable ways. And I'd have to say that my colleague, Devashish Basu, just a really brilliant guy, and just with a very different kind of background, but really kind of gets me to look at parts of the problems that I don't naturally look at. And it's really a byproduct of sort of my training. I mean, I came from mathematical logic and philosophy, and you don't really like, you can abstract away a lot of the messiness and the noise. But Devashis was trained in the kind of engineering tradition of like the kind of great signal processing kind of engineers, like in Bell Labs, and they have good techniques for dealing with a lot of messiness and dealing with a lot of chaos, like that actually work, and are scalable. And I think like seeing that vulnerability in my training and trying to, because he was very patient and always has been very patient with my kind of debating him. I think I think I really just lucked out there. I just met some really good people who just had the patience to listen to a philosopher's abstract nonsense until we found some kind of happy medium. And they still joke around. They call me, Devashis will call me a methodological purist, and like that I'm so focused on my Bayesianism and all this kind of stuff. And but in all honesty, I've learned a ton. I wouldn't change that.
I love that.
The people.
Ever the philosopher, Jeff. Shay, bring us home. What's up, buddy?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff, for your time, and Matt for hosting this. Have learned a ton, and I'm actually procrastinating on my Bayesian midterm right now, so this is a good look at what you just said. My question for you is, what's the top analytics work people working towards behavior change should be doing that most aren't?
The top analytics work. Well, I mean, look, you should learn lots of tools, methods. I mean, I don't know what the top problem. I mean, there are problems in that we're working on, but some of them are probably unique to our situation and what we currently need. Right now, the kinds of problems are very dictated by what the business really feels like it needs now. We don't have the luxury to be on like a 2-year timeline for our project now. We're more like 4 months because of how small we are. Maybe someday in the future we could be more speculative, but now I have to do. I can't really risk doing things that have a small chance of panning out. I need to focus on things where sometimes what I'll do is I'll hedge a little bit, and I'll have like some models that are just kind of in my back pocket, and then I know that I can, and then some that are more experimental, and we might bring them online if they become competitive and start behaving well. But I would say, like, I mean, my stack, I tend to use, like, I write a lot in Stan, which is a probabilistic programming language. I use, I use R a lot. I use Python a lot. I use SQL a lot. Those are probably the four. Probably Stan, Python, R, SQL are probably the things that I use the most. I do tend to kind of, tend to frame things in a Bayesian way, but I also do a lot of machine learning where that Bayesian stuff is probably not even like, it's just not feasible. It's not scalable. So I do a lot of like, kind of chainsaw type, machine learning, I mean, so it depends you got to know, you have to have the tools that are right for the job, right? I mean, like I said, when we have things come in and there's like kind of semi-structured data, like, it's a single payload's 30,000 lines of of JSON, I'm not going to do like, I'm going to end up with thousands and thousands of features, and I'm not going to try to do some kind of like careful Bayesian thing there. I'm really like, I'm just going to do, it's going to be very black box kind of, stuff. So it really depends. You have to be flexible. I think knowing your methods is one thing, but really thinking through the problem is the most important thing, right? I mean, you could end up doing some simple models, but if you thought out the problem carefully and you have kind of critical control over it and stuff like that, then simple models can often do really well. It's really a question of like, I think, thinking through the problem. Like, what are you trying to do? What's the problem you're trying to because that can drift so quickly. It's amazing how we can lose sight of that. And that's why, like, the one thing that I've always loved about kind of, so going back to my early education, I mean, the decision theoretic tradition that I grew up in was like, well, statistics is really about decision making under uncertainty. And that's the view of like LJ Savage and people like that. And that really, you're estimating things because you want to make a decision. There's some decision that's at the end, ultimately, and that focus of trying to constantly find my way back to the decision that we're solving for, even though that evolves sometimes, that's been huge. I think that's bigger than any. It's that I really do try to make the decision that we're focusing on like the goal. And that's like the way that I try to push back about, like, I have seen so many times people come up with kind of what I think are kind of cockamamie analytics, metrics, that just seem like they're cooked up. And I'm like, and I find like sometimes the best way to refocus the whole discussion is being like, hey, everybody, what decision making are we trying to improve here? How is this going to be? How would we know if this is actually improving the decision making? And getting people to step back and that sort of scientific mindset has been like, that's almost more important than any particular, technical thing that I do.
What a great way to end us. Jeff, thanks so much for spending some time with me. I know you've got a ton on your plate. We'll get this edited and posted to everybody. Good to see you, Shay and Florent and others. And I look forward to seeing you next month when we'll interview our next person, Jeff. Good to see you, brother.
Good to see you. Take care, my friend.
Peace.
All best. Bye.